Living in a royal palace may sound like a dream for many, but for the four Saudi princesses, it's turned into a nightmare.
Living in a royal palace, a dream turned nightmare. Living in a royal palace may sound like a dream for many, but for four Saudi princesses, it turned into a nightmare. These four princesses, daughters of the 89-year-old King Abdullah, are alleged to have been singled out for extreme treatment. They claim they have been locked away from the world for 13 years. In 2014, a shocking protest took place outside the Saudi embassy in London. The former wife of Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah, a woman with a path as complex as her ex-husband's rule, demanded the release of her four daughters. The daughters of King Abdullah claimed that they, along with their other sisters Maha and Hala, had been kept as virtual prisoners. The princesses, all adults, had been held under strict orders from their father for years. They lived in isolation within the confines of a secluded villa, cut off from the outside world. What led to such a grim situation? What had happened to these four royal sisters over the years? And why, after all this time, were these secrets finally coming to light? Stay with us to learn the full heartbreaking story, one that the world has only just begun to understand. A darker reality behind a reformist king. The story of these four Saudi princesses captured international attention. Their father, King Abdullah, was once one of the most influential leaders in the world, controlling one of the wealthiest countries on earth. His estimated fortune was around $15 billion. Known for being a powerful monarch and a reformer, King Abdullah made history by pushing for certain rights for women in Saudi Arabia. He allowed women to participate in government advisory roles, pursue higher education, and join the workforce in fields that had once been closed to them. King Abdullah ibn Abdulaziz was seen as a reformer who recently ruled that women should be allowed to vote in local elections. For many, these were groundbreaking changes that painted him as a forward-thinking leader, someone willing to bring modernization to his nation. But behind the headlines of progress, a darker reality existed within his own family. His four daughters were kept imprisoned in a villa for more than a decade. This wasn't a life of luxury or privilege. It was a life of severe confinement. The princesses were denied food and basic care, subjected to mistreatment, and forced into silence by the harsh hand of sedation. Why would a man known for his reforms turn on his own daughters so ruthlessly? The life of their mother, Alanaud al-Assad. To answer that, we need to explore the life of their mother, Alanaud al-Assad, a woman who, once upon a time, defied the royal family's authority. Born into a prestigious Jordanian family in 1957, Alanaud al-Assad came from the prominent al-Assad tribe. At just 15 years old, her parents arranged for her to marry King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. At the time, he was around 50, more than twice her age. It was a marriage with no room for love, choice, or personal will, an arrangement made solely for political and social reasons. In fact, Alanaud had never even met her future husband before their wedding day. How could a young girl be expected to love a man old enough to be her grandfather? This wasn't an isolated case, but rather a harsh reality for many girls in the Arab world, where alliances and tribal politics often take precedence over personal happiness. Marrying elderly men in the name of family agreements is a deeply unjust practice that robs young girls of their childhood and future choices. At the time of her marriage, King Abdullah had already been married multiple times. He had around 30 wives and 36 children. Abdullah is survived by more than 30 children from a dozen wives, with each wife and their children often confined to separate palaces, living isolated lives with minimal interaction. Despite his public image as a reformer, within his own household, Abdullah maintained a rigid patriarchal structure, a mirror of the broader societal dynamics in Saudi Arabia. A mother's love amid hardship. For Alanaud, her marriage wasn't just the loss of love, but the beginning of a life filled with isolation and hardship. Though she lived in one of the wealthiest palaces imaginable, surrounded by luxury, her heart remained empty. Over the years, she came to terms with her fate, a life defined by wealth but lacking true fulfillment. Alanaud gave birth to four daughters: Princess Jawahar, Princess Hala, Princess Maha, and Princess Sahar. These girls became her world, the only source of light in a life that felt increasingly confined. The emotional isolation behind opulence. Unfulfilled despite the opulent surroundings, Alan's happiness remained elusive. She was living in luxury, but it was a luxury that came with emotional isolation. King Abdullah, her husband, ruled their household with an iron fist, much like the monarch he was. It was nearly impossible for her to love a man who not only was much older than her, but whose values and personality were so different from her own. Yet it was the king's growing frustration over one key issue that would mark the beginning of the end for their marriage. King Abdullah, like many leaders of the time, placed immense value on having male heirs. Despite already having several sons from his other marriages, he was fixated on having a son with Alanaud. To him, sons were not just children, they were symbols of legacy, power, and continuity. Daughters, in his eyes, were less significant, no matter their achievements or worth. Alan's inability to provide a son further angered him. A deteriorating marriage. The king allegedly grew increasingly frustrated with Alanaud for not giving him a son. His disdain for her deepened, and he soon turned his attention to his other wives and mistresses. Their relationship deteriorated to the point where he stopped living with her altogether. It is believed that after the birth of their fourth daughter, the king may have divorced Alanaud. However, in Saudi Arabia at the time, a man could divorce his wife without even informing her, leaving her in a state of confusion and helplessness. Alanaud's life became a paradox. She lived in a grand palace surrounded by wealth, yet her emotional life was in ruins. She had become little more than a vessel for producing sons, an expectation that overshadowed her existence and led to her eventual emotional neglect. Finding solace in motherhood. For Alanaud, her daughters became her only comfort in a world filled with wealth, but devoid of love and respect. Princesses Jauhar, Hala, Maha, and Sahar were her source of joy. As they grew, they experienced the full luxury of royal life. Their upbringing seemed like something out of a fairy tale, an education of the highest quality, global travel, stays in five-star hotels, vacations at exclusive resorts, and wardrobes filled with the finest designer clothes. From the outside, their lives appeared perfect, untouched by the struggles most people face. However, behind the glittering facade, the reality for women in Saudi Arabia, royalty or not, was far more restricted. The hidden costs of privilege. Under the country's guardianship laws, women were required to have a male guardian for almost every aspect of their lives. Studying, working, traveling abroad, opening a bank account, or seeking medical care all required permission from a father, brother, husband, or even a son. For the princesses, their father, King Abdullah, was their guardian. Despite his often strict nature, he allowed them significant freedom during their childhood, providing them with every material comfort. Given his vast wealth, estimated in the billions, it was no surprise that he spared no expense in ensuring they lived in luxury. The princesses never had to worry about money, nor did they need to plan for their future. They were provided for in every way. Yet, this life of privilege came at a hidden cost, their complete dependence on their father. Though they lived in abundance, they had no control over their own lives. The king's word was law, and they were expected to obey without question. No matter how much they had, in the eyes of the law and their father, they were still bound by rules that left them powerless. A mother's escape. In 2003, Alanaud, no longer able to endure her life in a gilded cage with a husband she couldn't love, made a daring decision to escape. With the help of a women's rights organization, she boarded a flight to London, leaving behind the palace and her life in Saudi Arabia. After their mother was divorced by the king, things deteriorated, and she eventually fled to London. In the UK, she found solace in her newfound freedom, hoping one day her daughters would join her. Leaving her 4 daughters behind was one of the hardest decisions Alanaud ever made. By then, however, the girls were grown and independent. Alanaud believed they were safe. After all, as daughters of the king, they were protected by the wealth and power of their father, who had always been generous to them, granting freedom she had never known. Little did she know, the nightmare was about to unfold. When King Abdullah found out about her escape, His reaction was swift and furious. Even though he had long since abandoned their marriage, his focus shifted. A father's fury unleashed. Even as King Abdullah focused on his other wives and mistresses, he still considered Alanaud his property. Her bold move to take control of her life without his permission struck at the core of his authority. His ego was wounded, and his anger knew no bounds. In his fury, Abdullah vowed to make her pay where it would hurt the most, through her daughters. They will die slowly and painfully, he is said to have declared, showing the depth of his wrath. Immediately after Alanaud left, the king revoked the princesses' passports, trapping them in Saudi Arabia without the ability to travel or seek refuge elsewhere. He placed them under strict house arrest, confining them to a private villa that had once been their home but was now their prison. This wasn't just punishment. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would last over 10 years. Voices of change in a silenced world. King Abdullah had another reason for isolating his daughters. As they grew older, the princesses began to ask uncomfortable questions about the state of affairs in Saudi Arabia. Educated, intelligent, and compassionate, they couldn't ignore the injustices around them. They began advocating for human rights, justice, and equality, topics that were taboo in a monarchy where dissent was swiftly crushed. One of the most outspoken sisters was Princess Hala. While interning at a hospital in Riyadh, she made a shocking discovery in the psychiatric ward. She found political prisoners, people being forcibly sedated and punished with heavy medication for expressing opinions that went against the government's narrative. Horrified, Princess Hala spoke out, calling on the authorities to address this horrific injustice. She raised her voice to defend those who had none, determined to shine a light on the inhumane treatment taking place under the regime. Repression and retaliation. Princess Hala's actions, however, did not sit well with King Abdullah. For him, any criticism, especially from his own daughter, was unforgivable. His response was swift and brutal. He ordered Princess Hala's arrest and sent her to a women's prison deep in the desert. Her punishment served as a chilling warning to her sisters, who were also beginning to face consequences for their growing dissent. Princesses Jauhar, Maha, and Sahar, like Hala, had been vocal about the issues plaguing Saudi society. They questioned their father about the stark contrast between the country's vast wealth from oil and the rampant poverty many citizens faced. Their questions, though valid, were met with anger and denial. As punishment for their defiance, all four sisters, Jauhar, Hala, Maha, and Sahar, were placed under house arrest in a royal villa. A gradual descent into isolation. At first, their situation, though restrictive, was bearable. They had limited outings under strict supervision and were allowed internet access, enabling them to stay in contact with the outside world, including their mother, Alanaud. But as the sisters continued to resist their confinement and shared their struggles with the world, their conditions worsened. King Abdullah, furious at their defiance, imposed harsher restrictions. The sisters were deprived of food and water for long periods, denied medical care, and heavily sedated to suppress their spirits and voices. Harassment from their half-brothers became a constant torment. A mother's fight for justice. By 2005, Alanaud was deeply alarmed about her daughter's safety, fearing for their lives. Knowing how far her ex-husband would go to silence them, she refused to stay passive. Though thousands of miles away in London, Alanaud decided to take action. In 2014, she took her fight to the global stage. Alanaud staged protests outside the Saudi Arabian embassy in London, holding signs and demanding her daughter's release. She sent a heartfelt letter to then U.S. President Barack Obama, urging him to use his influence to press the Saudi government. She also gave interviews to media outlets, shedding light on the horrifying treatment her daughters were enduring. A painful reminder of indifference. What did Alanaud manage to accomplish? Unfortunately, the answer is a painful reminder of the world's indifference. While Western countries expressed outrage over the princess's treatment and sympathized with the suffering of women in Saudi Arabia, no real action was taken. Despite vocal condemnations, the same Western governments and corporations continued to buy Saudi oil, maintain lucrative business deals, and support the regime responsible for the repression. Indifference and silence. Chillingly indifferent. Saudi officials dismissed the plight of the princesses as a private matter. "This is a private matter," they declared, shutting the doors to any meaningful intervention. The suffering of the princesses was dismissed as if it were none of the world's concern. For the next decade, the fate of King Abdullah's daughters remained a closely guarded secret. Speculation and whispers swirled, but no concrete details emerged. It seemed as though the princesses had been erased from the public eye, their existence confined to the shadows of the palace. A doctor's revelation. It wasn't until 2024 that the truth finally came to light. Dr. Dwight Burdick, a physician who had worked for the Saudi royal family and treated the four princesses, shared the full story in an interview with The New Yorker. His account exposed the chilling conditions the sisters had endured during their years of captivity. Dr. Burdick had arrived in Saudi Arabia from Texas in the mid-1990s, eager for a new adventure. Bored with the routine of his job at a hospital in Texas and attracted by the promise of a substantial salary, he moved to the Middle East. He became a physician for the Saudi royal family, a position that promised prestige and financial rewards. For years, Burdick and his wife immersed themselves in Saudi culture, even converting to Islam and embracing the country's values and traditions. However, they remained unaware of the darker realities within the royal household. The nightmare unfolds. In 2008, Dr. Burdick learned about the imprisoned princesses. He was summoned to Princess Hala's quarters with an unsettling request to sedate her forcibly. Shocked and appalled, Burdick refused, as it violated his medical ethics. Determined to understand the situation better and help if possible, he requested permission to meet the other sisters. What he found horrified him. Princesses Hala and Maha, in particular, were deeply affected by years of forced sedation and trauma. They had become heavily dependent on alcohol and illicit substances, addictions imposed on them as a means of control. The sisters lived under constant surveillance, their every movement monitored by cameras and listening devices, creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear and anxiety, resistance and compassion. At times, the princesses' frustration and despair boiled over, leading them to lash out aggressively. During such moments, palace staff would summon medical personnel to sedate them. On his first visit to Princess Hala's quarters, Burdick was met with hostility. Overcome with anger and mistrust, she attacked him with a knife. Instead of retaliating or following orders to sedate her, Burdick chose to speak calmly. This interaction left a deep impression on him. He saw not just anger, but a desperate plea for help in her eyes. He understood that these women were not criminals, but victims of a system designed to break their spirits. Though he had little power to change their situation, Burdick continued to visit the sisters, offering medical care and emotional support whenever he could. He recognized the dire state of Princesses Hala and Maha, who needed professional treatment to overcome their dependence and regain their freedom. A bold plan, crushed by power. Dr. Burdick devised a bold plan to help the sisters. He proposed sending Princesses Hala and Maha to a world-renowned rehabilitation center in California, hoping this would help them regain their strength and independence. He even dreamed that once the two sisters were safely abroad, Jawahar and Sahar could eventually join them. However, the royal court immediately rejected his proposal. Officials made it clear that the sisters would never be allowed to leave Saudi Arabia. They warned Burdick that pressing the issue further would put both his and his wife's safety at risk. The message was blunt and unmistakable. Any attempt to help the sisters escape would not be tolerated. Small triumphs amidst captivity. Realizing the immense danger of defying the powerful regime, Dr. Burdick reluctantly abandoned his escape plan. Instead, he resolved to assist the princesses as best he could within the confines of their captivity. Under his guidance, Princess Hala made significant progress. She overcame her dependency on alcohol and illicit substances, a remarkable recovery that gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Dreams of freedom. To dream of a life beyond the palace walls, Princess Hala began to find hope. As her hope for freedom grew stronger, she believed that with her father's approval, she might one day leave Saudi Arabia and start anew. Encouraged by her progress, Dr. Burdick arranged a meeting between Hala and King Abdullah. During the meeting, which took place over a formal dinner, Hala made her case. She spoke of her recovery, her renewed sense of self, and her desire to travel abroad. She asked for permission to go to Italy, where she hoped to build a new life. King Abdullah listened intently, but his response was as calculated as it was dismissive. He told Hala her request would only be considered if she fulfilled one condition. She must first marry a Saudi Muslim man of his choosing. Only after doing so, he claimed, would he consider granting her permission to leave the country. Hala was devastated. She understood this was no genuine offer, but a way to keep her under his control. Marriage to a man of his choosing would tighten the chains of her captivity. Without hesitation, she refused his condition, reaffirming her desire for independence. Increased cruelty. In 2014, after her mother Alanaud raised global awareness about her daughter's plight, the situation for the princesses took a dramatic turn. The royal family, furious at the unwanted attention, began to treat the sisters even more cruelly. They were sometimes deprived of food, and their water supply was cut off for extended periods as punishment. Unable to stand by and watch them suffer, Dr. Burdick, who still had access to the royal compound, took matters into his own hands. Since he wasn't thoroughly searched, he secretly collected leftovers from the king's table and smuggled them to the sisters. These scraps of food became vital for their survival during the harshest periods of their captivity. To ensure the princesses could no longer reach out for help, their captors stripped them of all means of communication. Their phones, internet access, and any form of outside contact were taken away. Isolated and silenced, the sisters were left entirely at the mercy of their father and his guards. A painful departure. As the situation worsened, Dr. Burdick and his wife came to a heart-wrenching conclusion. They could no longer help the sisters. The oppressive environment, combined with constant threats to their safety, left them with no choice but to leave Saudi Arabia and return to the United States. Before their departure, they arranged one final visit with Princess Maha. The sight of her left them utterly shocked. Her hair had nearly fallen out. Her body was swollen from malnutrition and medication she had been forced to take, and her mental state had deteriorated severely. The vibrant young woman they once knew had been reduced to a mere shadow of herself. Dr. Burdick was devastated. Despite his medical expertise and every effort to help, the damage done to the princess's physical and emotional well-being was irreversible. The trauma they had suffered, torture, isolation, and manipulation, had left them emotionally scarred, and their resilience was worn down to despair. Enduring tragedy. In 2015, King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud passed away. Yet even after his death, the sisters remained imprisoned. Before his passing, it was reported that the king had vowed the women would never be released, ensuring their continued captivity even beyond his lifetime. His power and the royal family's unyielding grip on authority left no room for defiance. The tragic reality of their imprisonment continued to cast a dark shadow over the four princesses. In 2021, years after leaving Saudi Arabia, Dr. Burdick received heartbreaking news from friends still in the country. Princess Hala had passed away from an unnamed chronic illness. The royal court announced her death, but offered no further details, leaving the circumstances shrouded in mystery. 6 months later, Princess Maha also passed away. This time, the palace didn't even release an official statement. Her death was briefly mentioned on social media by a humanitarian foundation linked to King Abdullah. The lack of official acknowledgement or explanation for their deaths only deepened the sense of secrecy and injustice surrounding their lives. A haunting silence. The fate of the two remaining sisters, Princesses Jawahar and Sahar, remains unknown. It's believed they are still held in confinement in Saudi Arabia, though there is the haunting possibility that they may no longer be alive. The lack of information surrounding their lives only deepens the mystery and tragedy of their situation. Their isolation was so complete, it was almost as though they had been erased from history, their existence hidden from the world. Despite years of silence and global efforts to raise awareness, their fate remains uncertain. A mother's hope. Their mother, Alanaud Al-Alas, now lives in London. She continues to hold on to the hope that, despite everything, a reunion might still be possible. Alanaud refuses to give up on her daughters, her unwavering determination a testament to a mother's boundless love and commitment. Does such a reunion seem possible? This story highlights the harsh reality of living under a repressive regime where women have no rights or freedom. Even princesses, the daughters of a king, are silenced and stripped of their voices. What chance, then, do ordinary women have in a system that so ruthlessly crushes any semblance of agency or autonomy? If this story has moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you for watching.